welcome to the Acid Trash Jamboree, and to another Prog and Psych Picks overview, where we take a look at a handful more albums from the halcyon days of the psychedelic and progressive scenes. So let's not beat around the bush and instead get stuck into today's offerings. Okay, so there was a lot of talk of King Crimson influence in the last Prog and Psych Picks video. So how's about we kick off with an LP by a bona fide Crimson associate? Yes, Still by Peter Sinfield, who of course was Crimson's lyricist between 1969 and 1971, but had moved on to the Emerson, Lake and Palmer camp by the time this was released, on ELP's own Manticore imprint no less, and with Greg Lake lending a hand on production, vocal and instrumental duties. Though yeah, he's not the only musical heavyweight featured here, as Sinfield also invited other Crimson-affiliated folk along for the ride, like John Wetton, Ian Wallace, Mel Collins, Boz Burrell, and jazz piano legend Keith Tippett, as well as cult folk hero Keith Christmas and pedal steel wizard BJ Cole, among many other fine talents. So, quite the lineup, but is the resulting LP any good? Well, for me at least, Still is quite a mixed bag. Opener, the Vivaldi reference in Song of the Sea Goat, is a rather dramatic and melancholic nautical ballad, in the lineage of Procol Harum's A Salty Dog, perhaps, with promising verses leading rather nondescriptly into a kind of underwhelming chorus. Music and arrangement-wise, this is highly reminiscent of what Barclay James Harvest were up to around about the same time, on their similarly teetering on the brink of falling apart, orchestrated numbers. The aforementioned Keith Tippett takes a piano solo midway through, though unfortunately it's far from his finest work. Next up is Under the Sky, a co-write with another one-time Crimson fella, Ian MacDonald, which was initially recorded by the wonderful pre-Crimson Giles and Fripp, though their take wasn't released officially until the early 90s from what I can gather. And it's a pleasantly mellow psychedelic folk tune, juxtaposing reverbed out flute and synth parts against a curious, burbling, Bitches Brew styled layer of electric piano and what sounds like an oboe or baritone sax, which ground the song somewhat and stop it from floating off into the ether. The country folk effort, Will It Be You, is just okay in a post all things must pass kind of way. And speaking of George Harrison, the brash, Roxy music meets the rocky horror show of Whole Food Boogie plays out like the inverse of his cautionary tale Savoy Truffle off the White Album, though again, musically it's nothing to write home about, though I guess it's grown on me slightly since I first heard it, so that's something. The title tune forms the LP's centrepiece, alternating between proto-David Tibet spoken word sections and more of that slightly overblown, almost desperate and anguished sounding Barclay James Harvest symphonic balladry. The following song, Envelopes of Yesterday, is easily my favourite thing here. A world-weary, glamish number, very obviously drawing on the Bowie and Mott the Hoople music of the same time, but topped off with a Jabriath-esque country flavour, and Sinfield's sharp, untrained vocals, lending the tune a nicely Peter Hamill-ish bite. So yeah, quite the mixture. The Donovan-styled folk whimsy of the piper is Still's most stripped-back moment, whilst A House of Hopes and Dreams is another good one in that resigned-sounding, country-fried glam style. Then the finale, The Night People, mostly hinges around a slow, sleazy horn rock arrangement, eventually coming to life in its closing moments, the brass section really letting rip during the instrumental coda. This 2009 Esoteric Recordings issue adds another CD of bonus material, including early mixes of the whole LP, barring Will It Be You, as well as the sweet, easygoing folk blues of Outtake Hanging Fire, and the teary, maudlin breakup song Can You Forgive a Fool, recorded a couple of years after Still. Now, despite being obsessed with that whole axis of King Crimson music since my teens, so yeah, around a quarter of a century now, for whatever reason, Still was never at the top of my shopping list, meaning I only got around to buying it relatively recently. This is quite a shame actually, as there's definitely some gems here that I would have loved way back when, particularly in the second half of the record. Granted, his vocals take some getting used to. Indeed, Sinfield himself would be the first to admit that he sounds pretty strained and is punching above his weight in parts. But as I said, this gives it that fragile, Barclay James Harvest quality that, over time, I've really come to enjoy. Next, we head over the pond, where we find this self-titled collection of music by the Appleton, Wisconsin band Soup. And yeah, in spite of the group's stripped-back, three-piece lineup, this is actually another pretty diverse offering. The first 6 tunes here originally came out in 1970 as a self-titled, self-released LP, opening with a version of the old rock and roll standard, Mailman Bring Me No More Blues, first performed by Buddy Holly, but also covered by the Beatles at various points during their career. Soup's reading is fairly straightforward and countrified, with only the odd bit of power riffing hinting towards their more underground leanings, so not of much interest from a psychedelic point of view. Similarly, the swinging jazz blues of I'm Just Not the Man to Be Tied sounds like a bit of a throwback to the mid-60s. Yeah, it's only really on the extended cut Deer and Blue where things start to get a bit more exciting, with its cool roots rock meets West Coast psych groove and exploratory, solo-heavy structure. This segues directly into Black Cat Blues in melody, another number in that organic, mellow, acid country rock style, not a million miles away from the Grateful Dead at their most melodic, or the pre-Blue Oyster Cult project Stalk Forest Group. The lovely, woozily jazzy waltz, Tennessee, is probably my favourite thing here. Again, this brings to mind those other groups I just mentioned, as well as Quicksilver Messenger Service, circa Shady Grove. The next cut is the 15-minute I'm So Sorry, a live recording which took up all of side 2 on the original LP. And yeah, if you're at all fed up of elongated blues workouts, then you probably won't get much out of this. Though actually, far from being a tedious, turgid 12-bar plod, this is much more along the lines of a group like Taste, with singer-guitarist Doug Yankus ably proving he was no slouch on the 6th string. Indeed, with a nicely Rory Gallagher-style fluidity to his soloing, the track getting hairier and more wigged out the longer it runs. The rest of the songs here are bonus tracks, both sides of Soup's 1969 single, of which I prefer the yearning, Jack Bruce-ish B-side Veronica to the bog-standard garage R&B of Big Boss Man, plus 2 unreleased tunes, including the folk baroque acoustic guitar showcase Song for Jackie, which was obviously heavily informed by Davy Graham's legendary piece Angie. After this, we get all 8 sides of the singles that Yankus penned between 1967 and 68, whilst part of the pre-Soup group, The Private Property of Diggill. These are all very pleasant, jangly garage pop ditties, albeit derivative of the big hitters of the time, the Byrds, the aforementioned Beatles, the Searchers, and the Who, to name but 4. Yeah, check out Jewelry Lady in particular, which is a dead ringer for the latter's Mary Ann with the shaky hand. So yeah, as I said, there's a pretty varied selection of music here. So this may feel a touch disappointing if you're a hardcore psych head looking for non-stop acid thrills. But as a smorgasbord of assorted 60s styles, I actually find it pretty entertaining. Soup went on to release one more album in 1971, entitled The Album Soup, though unfortunately Doug Yankus passed away not too long after in the early 80s due to complications from diabetes. So yeah, tragic end to an extremely promising talent. Third on the agenda today, we have the lone album by New Zealand cosmonauts Space Farm, originally released on the Zodiac label. Made up of 3 former members of blues rock legends The Underdogs, a group with a formidable amount of ties to other cool bands, including founder member Harvey Mann. Space Farm were a going concern for just a couple of years, with this album coming out slap bang in the middle of their existence in 1972. The LP gets underway with perhaps its trippiest moment, the band's eponymous tune, a heavily phased groover, pitched somewhere between the propulsive psychedelia of early Spirit and the eccentric floppiness of Gong, also factoring in some of Sid-era Floyd's chromatic power chord menace for good measure. So yeah, quite the statement of intent. Elsewhere, the influence of early Hendrix is hard to deny, with some of the tunes coming over pretty much like cut and paste Frankenstein jobs. Space Farm liberally rewriting and reassembling classic Experience riffs and licks for their own needs. Take Waking Dream, for example, which is equal parts Third Stone from the Sun, The Wind Cries Mary and Castles Made of Sand, whilst Gypsy Queen is Red House by way of Voodoo Child. What's interesting about Space Farm's sound, though, is how much they rely on clean-toned guitars in place of overdriven ones. Yeah, you'd expect it to be hard for a band of Jimmy acolytes to resist stomping on a fuzz face for some filthy martial destruction, but this isn't the case. What it does reveal is what a formidable guitarist they had in Harvey Mann. Yeah, as any string diddler will know, when you're playing cleanly, there's pretty much nowhere to hide. So yeah, Mann's decision to play these oftentimes intricate parts, naked as it were, was brave to say the least, and ably demonstrates what command he has over his axe. That said, the whole band were obviously extremely proficient musicians. Props especially to their drummer, Glenn Absolom, whose loose, liquid way with the kit is highly impressive. As a record, overall, this is a highly enjoyable work. It's 6 rockers, 2 ballads and a blues makeup, and ever-present, trippy production, giving it a satisfying consistency. Though almost to the point where, at least for the first few listens, the songs all kind of blur into one. If Space Farm do have a weakness, it's in the vocal department. Yeah, as good as his guitar skills are, Harvey Mann is far from a natural singer, though the more I listen to him, again, the more I pick up on some Gong similarities. His delivery sounding at times somewhere between David Allen and Steve Hillage. So yeah, this may be a turn-off for some, but not for me. The record company evidently had an issue with Mann's abilities on the mic, going so far as to draft in another vocalist, namely Murray Grindley, former leader of the Underdogs, to re-record his parts. This alternative version of the album came out later on in 1972, and was also the version used on the first LP and CD reissues, where it was retitled Going Home to Eternity, though this Ascension Records and Zodiac co-release CD from 2000 features only the original Mann version. Lastly for now, we have the self-titled 1971 album by Spring, a band formed in Leicester in the UK around the nucleus of vocalist and multi-instrumentalist Pat Moran and bassist Adrian Bone Maloney. This pair first collaborated in Sleepy John's Opus, a mid-60s school band in which Moran was the drummer. The first lineup of Spring coming together a couple of years later, by which time he'd moved on to lead vocals. After a fortuitous meeting with a man named Kingsley Ward in 1969, the band were offered some sessions in Ward's recording studio, the now legendary Rockfield, which had opened a few years prior and was still finding its feet. Ward also went on to manage the group for a time, finally getting them to make an LP in late 1970, with sessions taking place at both Rockfield and also at Trident in London. Okay, so Spring opens with, for me, its two strongest tunes, The Prisoner 8x10 and Grail, both rather slow and majestic numbers, obviously indebted compositionally to symphonic prog forefathers like the Moody Blues, Genesis and early King Crimson, but imbued with a dreamy lightness of touch and sense of melancholic pastoralism that's all their own. Yeah, the guitars are mostly pushed back in the mix, especially on The Prisoner, the pieces instead drifting by on delicate layers of mellotron, topped off with crisp, sometimes militaristic drumming from future Dire Straits man Pick Withers, and laid back but confident and soulful vocals from Moran. Following on from the pleasant but inconsequential folky waltz of Boats, it's not until Shipwrecked Soldier that Spring really start to rock. The song's dense, wordy verses, delivered over a pulsing, groovy psychedelic backing, coming across like Dylan's It's All Right Ma, rewritten by Arthur Brown. Next we have Golden Fleece, which opened up side B of the original LP. A fairly bombastic, mid-pace number, powered along by strident acoustic guitar and trumpeting mellotron fanfares. Nice enough though, as I said, for me there's not really anything else on the record that surpasses the opening two tunes, so I often find my attention wandering slightly by the time I get to this point. The mostly pedestrian rocker Inside Out doesn't do much to remedy the situation, in spite of its spirited outro, whilst the sparse piano ballad, Song to Absent Friends, provides a bit of a breather in amidst the more florid full band stuff. But it still isn't anything to write home about, sounding like the sort of thing that might have cropped up on a late period Rare Bird LP. Thankfully the closer, Gazing, returns us in part to the vibe of The Prisoner and Grail, with yet more of those sumptuously sad clouds of mellotron strings to the fore. But even so, it seems curiously half-written and never really goes anywhere, in spite of its 6-minute length. Okay, so going back about 20 years now, I did have an old CD pressing of this album, but I wasn't feeling it at all and got rid of it rather swiftly. Revisiting it now, I can still kind of hear why it underwhelmed me back then, though as front-loaded as it is, I guess it's growing on me with each replay. Actually, it's probably for the best that I sold it on, otherwise I might never have bought this 2015 edition from Esoteric, which, as with the Peter Sinfield album, adds a whole disc's worth of extra material. Yeah, whilst the self-titled LP was the only one to see the light of day during the group's lifespan, Spring did actually record a bunch of stuff towards a follow-up, though unfortunately their label dropped them before they could make it a reality, ultimately causing them to split in 1972. These songs mostly find Spring heading in a much jazzier direction, with looser and more limber playing, and a greater sense of energy than on the debut, especially on the likes of Flying is an Easy Speed, and the brass-propelled opener Devil's Bandits, which is in line with what contemporaneous horn groups like Heaven and the Norman Haynes Band were up to. Mellower tunes like Fernley Avenue and the first of the two versions of Hendry Muse show they hadn't completely left their more reflective, pastoral roots behind. Then Beautiful Losers is another stark piano ballad, again very much in the style of later Rare Bird. While sonically it's apparent that a few of these are basic demo recordings, compositionally at least, this is mostly very strong stuff, reaching an apex during the killer trio of the trippy World Full of Whispers, the progglish soul prog of Painted Ship, and the steamy jazz rocker High Horses. Despite the Hammond organ being much more to the fore on these sessions, there's still a fair amount of Spring's signature Mellotron in evidence. So yeah, this is another essential listen for any Tron completists out there. Anyways, after Spring's split, Pat Moran went on to great success as an engineer and producer, working on a dizzying amount of awesome records by such acid trash faves as Skin Alley, Budgie, CMU, and the mighty Van de Graaff Generator, as well as household names like Queen, Robert Plant and Big Country, before sadly passing away in early 2011. So that wraps up another selection. Thanks for watching. As I've said before, there's plenty more to come along similar lines, so feel free to hit subscribe to be kept up to date on all that, and I'll catch you next time on the Acid Trash Jamboree.